So with the help of, actually I couldn't have done it without Meesh Pierce, we put together the fentanyl presentation, and we're privileged to have Dr. Deyhimy, anesthesiologist and addiction medical expert, and our Orange County Sheriff Sergeant Brian Gunsolley. They're going to be informing us on all sorts of new and different things. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Meesh and we'll get started.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the people I know in the audience for coming and trusting me with this, and also for those who don't know me, thank you for coming. This is a really important discussion. My background is I've worked in tech for a long time, and now I run a leadership podcast, and I actually had David Deyhimy on my podcast, on my show. He and I grew up together, so we were in middle school through high school together. That's how we know each other. He's an addiction medicine specialist, and I was introduced to Sergeant Gunsolley a couple months ago. And I thought, you know what, I've been wanting to put an event like this together, but how great would it be to pull them both together to do this? I know that Brian has spoken a lot in the local high schools and whatnot. So very quickly, if you wouldn't mind, just like telling us a little tiny bit about yourselves. I know, we have all the information here on the screen.
Okay, hi, I'm David Deyhimy, and I'm an anesthesiologist at Saddleback Memorial and a number of surgery centers sort of down towards south side of San Clemente. And I've been there since 2000, and started in 2007. And after about 4 years of being in private practice, I was kind of looking to do other things. And this was probably around 2010, 2011, and the pill epidemic was sort of the main thing making headlines, particularly OxyContin. And one night I was working on labor and delivery with a nurse, and she was talking about her son's heroin addiction and how he started with pills and then it became heroin after that. And she was talking about various medications that he was on to help treat his cravings, and I hadn't heard of these medications, and I'm like, and I'm an anesthesiologist, so I'm like, I should know all the drugs. And so I just became curious, and I couldn't believe like how fast this problem was growing in the United States. And sadly, here we are 11 years later, and it's gotten so much worse. And we've gone from pills to heroin, and now it's all synthetic opioids, pretty much contaminating the entire drug supply. And so anyways, that's become...
That's your why.
That's my why, yeah. So.
And you've got kids. How old are your kids?
I have 2 daughters. I have a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old.
Okay. Pass it over to Brian. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Sergeant Brian Gunsolley with the Sheriff's Department, and been on the department for 24 years. And right now I'm in charge of our community engagement unit, and a lot of what we do is drug prevention education. And so we go around to different schools. I've actually created a drug prevention program for 6th graders. Over the pandemic, we needed something like that to fill the gap and to deal with this fentanyl issue. We do assemblies, been around the county doing assemblies. I sit on what's called the Child Death Review Team with the coroner's office, and we review all cases where a child has died during the previous quarter. And I just noticed over the past couple of years, this trend has just gotten worse and worse, where we're reviewing case after case after case of a child dying from fentanyl overdoses. And so I thought, well, what can I do? There's something more I can do and my team can do. And that is, let's get out into the community more and really start spreading awareness. And so that's what we do now. We're just out teaching as much as we can, spreading awareness, attending as many events as we can, fit on the schedule. So my team and I, so that's why we're here tonight, to talk about this.
And you have kids?
Yes, I have 2 kids, a 25 and 21-year-old. So they're grown and not out of the woods till they're 25. Their brain is not fully developed, right? So you got a 21-year-old who's still in the risky age that potentially could use something, but right now I'm not seeing any signs of that. So I am feeling good about that, but you never know. Got to keep an eye on it.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so this is gonna get really serious really fast, and it's really somber. So let's get into it. Quick stats. Fentanyl is the #1 killer of teens in Orange County. The Drug Enforcement Agency reports that 60% of seized pills contain lethal fentanyl, which is up from 42% the year prior. We don't have 2020, we don't have 2023 stats obviously, but it's a hockey stick curve. It is not good news. 50 million seized illicit pills in 2022, up from 20 million the year before. And overdose is the leading cause of US deaths, ages 18 to 45. The thing is, most weren't intending to use an opioid. Most were intending to use an illicit pill, or let's do some oxy, or let's do some marijuana, or whatever it might be. We're going to Coachella, let's have a little fun. And it's fentanyl laced, and they're dying. One time, one try. So that's super scary. Okay, so if we look at drug-involved overdose deaths, look at that curve. It is not pretty. In 2022, we don't have the stats yet, but it's estimated it's at 130,000 plus, and it costs us $500 billion each year for this. If we continue and we're looking at, the synthetic stuff here, this is also not a good curve. That synthetic opioid, which is primarily fentanyl, is way up there, almost at 80,000. And if we compare it to gun deaths, because we hear a lot about gun deaths, it's nowhere close. So total gun deaths in 2021 were 21,000. Suicide was 26,000. Teens killed, 4,600 mass shootings. So we're not even coming close to fentanyl, but we're not talking about fentanyl. Why? So now we're talking about it. Let's get everyone educated. Let's start spreading the word, and let's start saving lives. This is in Orange County. Same kind of curve. Not pretty. All right, so now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Deyhimy, and he's going to talk about what is fentanyl, because we've all heard it, but what exactly is it?
So before I talk about that, to tag on to a couple of things you said, you saw a 50% increase in seized pills in 1 year, and those pills are categorized as enough in one pill to kill a person. In addition to the seized pills, there was, what was it? Something like 14,000 pounds of powdered fentanyl. Taken together, that's 397 million lethal doses, more than the entire United States population by a lot. And that's just what was seized. So, Sergeant Gunsolley could probably say it was probably like, what, 1/10 of maybe what gets in? So this is how fast it's going up. And Meesh mentioned, that this is the #1 killer of kids and young adults. The entire drug supply, for all intents and purposes now, has fentanyl in it.
The illicit drug supply.
The illicit drug supply, yeah. Pharmaceutical is fine. And these pills that they're seizing, if you go on the DEA One Pill Can Kill website and you look at, they're identical. I mean, a Percocet and a Percocet, you cannot tell the difference. But it's not just opioids like Percocet, it's Adderall, it's Xanax. 90% of cocaine now that's tested has fentanyl in it. So I don't think of these as overdoses. In my addiction clinic, we treat people that are addicted to opiates, and when they get it wrong, like they use too much or they get more of a potent batch, then they overdose as a result. These are poisonings. There's a big differentiation, because when you're at Coachella and somebody says, "Hey, do you want an Adderall?" and you overdose because it's not Adderall and it's fentanyl, that's not overdose, it's poisoning. And so this is one of the awareness components that we're trying to bring tonight, is that there is no safe recreational drug use anymore. And we'll talk about the thing you can do about it, besides talking to your kids and people you care about, but just basically carrying the antidote, the reversal agent. And I'll leave it at that, and we'll get to fentanyl. So 85% of all deaths now are due to synthetic opioids like fentanyl, and the fentanyl that I use in the operating room, it's a great drug, because it's 50 times more potent than morphine. But what makes it really good is it has a very quick onset, and then it goes away really quickly too. So for its very stimulating yet short procedure, you can use fentanyl and you can reliably have it wear off quickly, but it's meant to be used with a trained physician who knows how to like support the airway, give supplemental oxygen. So it's used every day all over the world, fentanyl. And I mean, probably propofol, fentanyl are probably the two most used drugs I use every day in the operating room. And illicitly manufactured fentanyl, which is what we're talking about. So it went pills, and then heroin, very potent heroin filled the void when the pills became harder to get. And then on the heels of that came the synthetics. And the reason that the synthetics have exploded is because the profit margin associated with manufacturing synthetic illicit fentanyl is so high. It can be done 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. It doesn't involve growing poppies like heroin. Shipping it and getting it in the United States is so much easier because smaller amounts can be spread through the drug supply. And that's why we're seeing them pressed into pills now. You can't taste it, you can't smell it. There's no way to know if any fentanyl is in a pill or a powder that you're ingesting. And for that reason, this is why I call them poisonings, because people just have no idea. And then you can give a picture of the, so that's a fentanyl lab, a Mexican fentanyl lab. And they're literally all over the place. It started in China with Chinese labs manufacturing it and sending it in the mail. And the cartels quickly caught on that, like, wait, we could do this better, and we're directly across the border from the people who would pay a lot of money for it. So that's heroin, and heroin is basically two morphine molecules stuck back to back, and it gets into the brain very quickly because it crosses the blood-brain barrier. So heroin is 2x morphine, and fentanyl is 50x heroin or 100x morphine. And carfentanil, which is, there's many fentanyl derivatives, but carfentanil is 100x fentanyl or 10,000x morphine. It was developed to tranquilize elephants. And there are something like 100 known illicit fentanyl derivatives now. So they're basically taking the fentanyl molecule and constantly tweaking it to try to make it more potent and last longer, because again, the profit margin is the main driving force there. So no talk on opioids would be complete without talking about a little bit of the neuroscience. And one of the things I spend a lot of time doing is helping people understand that addiction is actually a disease. We know it's a chronic disease. It gets it has a lot of stigma associated with people who have drug and alcohol problems because of the behaviors we see. And the behaviors are symptoms of an untreated disease. So when people start using any type of substance, initially they do feel better. And the reason they feel better is the midbrain is having higher levels of dopamine than it typically sees. And what the midbrain is responsible for is anything pro-survival. It's things like good food, friends, sex, exercise, things that if you had higher dopamine levels and it makes it more likely for you to remember and be motivated to do those things again, that's pro-survival. And what drugs do is they rapidly hijack this pro-survival mechanism. And what happens very quickly with repeated drug use is it takes more and more drug to get the same effect, and that's called tolerance. And what your brain does is your brain says, wow, this is like 20 times more dopamine than I'm supposed to have. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make the receptors on the other end fewer, so that higher and higher amounts of dopamine being released from the presynaptic neuron are required to stimulate the same response. And that's tolerance. And then when you take it away, we all know what that is, that's withdrawal. And that's when people feel much worse than they normally would. Most of the patients that I treat have a mental health disorder. They have grown up in households where one or more parents had a drug or alcohol problem. There's a very high genetic transference. And they've had neglect, there's been trauma, abuse, things like that. So at baseline, where this is like not feeling good or bad, they're living always kind of below the baseline. They have less dopamine than is typical. And so a lot of drug use starts with people self-medicating, trying to feel just normal. But it rapidly gets out of control, especially with these types of potent drugs that we're talking about. So I just sort of wanted to give you all a background that this becomes a vicious cycle in a hurry. You have to start using more frequently, you have to start using higher doses, and pretty soon the part of your brain, which is the frontal cortex, which weighs decision-making and behaviors and risk, is taken entirely offline. And at that point, all drug use becomes about not going into withdrawal and just wanting to survive. And we have very, very effective medications to treat this problem. Unfortunately, most people in the United States don't know about them. And I can talk for a minute about that as well. But addiction, why is it a disease? Because it does the same things as other diseases. It has very similar relapse rates to other diseases. And we have treatments that are as effective as other treatments for other chronic diseases. But I can also show you that in a minute. We can also do fMRI and PET scans of the brain, and we can see the changes between a normal brain with healthy levels of dopamine receptors in certain areas and parts of the brains of people that have addictions or use disorders, where we can see that those dopamine receptors they're not nearly as the population of them is much reduced. So this is what I'm talking about. On the left, you have a healthy person, and this happens to be methamphetamine. And I think this person used for 14 months methamphetamine before they stopped. And 1 month after they stopped, you can see that their brain is nowhere near, the red area is the area with the dopamine receptors. They still have barely any dopamine receptors. And after 14 months, they're starting to look back to normal. So if they're not on medications to treat this, to help make up the difference, then they're just simply going to relapse, and almost certainly going to relapse and continue using. And this is a slide to show you that substance use disorders, which is all substance use disorders, whether it's alcohol, opioids, when lumped together, have similar relapse rates to other chronic diseases like diabetes, asthma, hypertension. It's not any different. So medication-assisted treatment is what we do at my MAT clinic, and there's basically 3 of them that exist for opioid use disorder. One is methadone, one is buprenorphine, and one is naltrexone. Unlike other substance use disorders, when we're talking about opioid use disorder, the relapse rates are incredibly high. And now with something as potent as fentanyl, it's even worse. And so 90-95% relapse rate is in the first 3 months after coming out of a drug and alcohol treatment center for people that are abstinents. Because remember the pictures of their brain? They don't have any dopamine receptors. So every waking minute, they're having cravings and they're feeling terrible and they're thinking, I have to make this stop. So that's why these medicines, they make up the difference, and they rapidly bring people back to a much higher state of functioning. And when on the proper medications, we have about 70 to 80% 1-year abstinence rates with opioid use disorder. That's how effective the medications are.
And interesting, when we were preparing for this, you're saying that Europe, your European colleagues and family members are saying, what opioid crisis? We don't have an opioid crisis here.
Yeah, Europe has been using these medications since the late 90s. And they have a different healthcare system. They have more of a socialized healthcare system. And when patients would come in with opioid use disorder, they would put them on these, everybody knew to put them on these medicines. And as a result, like France, for example, in the late 90s had a big heroin epidemic. And they expanded methadone, buprenorphine, and allowed primary care doctors to prescribe it, and made it very easy for the doctors to prescribe it. And within 4 years, they had a 90% reduction in their heroin crisis. And so as a result, they don't have opioid epidemic, and they don't serve as a rich target for any cartels, because they treated the problem very effectively once it started getting out of control, Portugal did the exact same thing.
Right. Okay, so now we're going to move on to how do we protect our kids? Because all that is super scary, right? And I think probably everyone in this room knows someone who has a substance use disorder of some type, or knows someone who has overdosed, etc. I'm not going to ask for show of hands, but I'm certain, and a lot of people have emailed me, called me up to this event saying, hey, I'm coming because I know someone. So now we're going to go on to what do we do?
Okay, so we know that right now our teens are at risk. Okay, it's the #1 killer of teens in Orange County. It's surpassing all other means in which they used to pass away. That is car accidents, drowning, suicides, gun violence. So we have to do something to protect them. Okay. One of the problems that we tend to do is we are in denial or we don't take action. So drug use and drug addiction takes off when we're in denial and we don't take action. And so if we recognize that there might be a drug problem, that's not the time to say, I'm sure it'll be fine, okay? Or just decide to not do anything about it, it's a fad, it'll go away. Drug use typically gets worse with time. If the younger someone starts to use, the more likely they'll become addicted to it. Many of these people who are using fentanyl, they use it for a short time, maybe to try it, or they get another type of drug that is like a Percocet. They're not actually getting a Percocet, they're getting, if it's coming from the internet, they're getting a fentanyl pill. About 98% of pills that are confiscated off the streets are fentanyl, even though they might look like an oxycodone, or they might look like a Percocet or Xanax. So these pills, if someone tries it and they like it, they'll get another one, and they'll get another one, and then they get hooked very quickly. It's 50 times more potent than heroin. So we're talking about something that's also very, very addicting. And so once they get hooked, they're willing to take the risk, and they want to try it more and more. Many times, young people, they start off with marijuana. They start off with alcohol, start off with something more simple, something they can get their hands on rather easily, and then they surround themselves with other friends who are using. So that is one symptom that we might see, is that, hey, we might not think that our child is using, but we can see that they're hanging out with other kids who are probably using. And so one of the highest risk factors for our kids is that them hanging out with somebody who's using. And so if they're not using yet, they probably will soon. Okay? And so what happens is when they're surrounded by those friends, other drugs get introduced, and then the potential for an overdose occurs. So making sure that we're keeping our kids safe, putting them into positive peer groups. If we notice that they're surrounding themselves with negative friends that you do not approve, then let's try and switch them over to some other type of group, right? That's more of a positive group. It's not the time to ignore it, it's the time to take action and do something. Now, if you notice that there's a decline in grades, there's a decline in behavior, sneaky behavior occurring, sweating, clamminess, pale skin, something, eyes are red, glossed over, something like that that indicates that there may be drug use, don't just stand by and ignore it, drug test. Okay, so teenagers are very, very good at convincing you that you did not see what you think you saw. Okay, you give them a home when they come home from a party and you smell alcohol on them, don't ignore it, right? Address it. They need increased supervision at that point. They need to maybe have their room searched. You don't know the extent of the problem quite yet, right? So maybe this has been going on for a long time and you're just now starting to figure out. In fact, a lot of times that's what happens with our teens, is that they are very good at hiding pipes, marijuana pipes or something, some type of paraphernalia. They're very good at hiding it at first, but with regular use they get sloppy, and then you see it, and now you're like, how long has this been going on there? That's the first time, or I'm holding it for Sally. But the truth is, it's theirs. If it's in their backpack, it's theirs, okay? And don't be tricked by that, okay? Now it's time to not freak out, but to figure out the extent of the problem, okay? And if you need to increase supervision and you need to check backpacks and you need to kind of take a look at things, their property, you own. If they're under 18 years of age, don't worry about taking something away. If you need to look in that phone, look in that phone. If they don't let you look in it, take it away, right? Give them a dumb phone, not a smartphone. You know, like something that doesn't get on the internet, but they can make a phone call with. So you can, one thing, I used to teach parenting classes at a high school that I worked at, and a discipline that we recommended was to take everything away for a short period of time. So you have, for instance, you give them so much. You give them iPads and video games, computers, iPhones, cars, and plenty of things for them to be entertained and to connect them with friends. But when they break a house rule, use drugs, commit some type of act that you prohibit, then you have to hand down some type of discipline. We can no longer put them in timeout, but we can take away all of their stuff. But you don't want to do it forever. For adults, we tend to want to take away things for 3 to 4 months at a time, right? But what you do is you take it away for 5 to 7 days, and then if they violate another house rule, you simply restart the original punishment over again until they've completed it, rather than adding on, okay? What that does is it allows that prefrontal cortex to get a little stronger and make decisions that whether or not they're going to choose to use drugs or not to use drugs. They have to start making hard choices because their stuff is going to be taken away when you catch them. And then they respect you also, and they realize you're not going to stand around and just let this happen. Okay, so that's just a tip that you could use to kind of lay down some ground rules, set some values for them, and say, hey, this is a non-drug using home. You are not going to be able to get away with that, and then you have some discipline to hand down as well. So one of the things is that it's being sold mostly on Snapchat. Snapchat because the message disappears once it's delivered within a few seconds. Now the thing about Snapchat is the drug dealers think that it's not being retained. Snapchat actually retains the records so that when we do an investigation, a homicide investigation, we can go and look at those records and see that there's a conversation between the victim and the drug dealer. Now, oftentimes we find, and the homicide detail and our narcotics detail is placed as high as 90%, that the people who are seeking fentanyl are seeking it on purpose. So we have to be aware of that fact as well, that there are people who get addicted very quickly and then they're seeking fentanyl, okay? So this may start off as casual drug use using something else like marijuana, circle of friends, and then a transition into maybe some pills, and now getting hooked very quickly. The more likely that someone uses, the more frequently that they use these drugs, the more likely they'll have an overdose, right? This stuff does not last very long in the body, so they need to continue to use to keep the high going. So one of the reasons why we have such a deadly epidemic is because these pills are being made a lot of times by farmers, like you saw on that previous slide. The cartels are not just feeding America, which happens to have the highest addiction rate than any other country in the world. They're also feeding the world, okay, with their addictions. And so they're making billions and billions of dollars. And so they have sophisticated laboratories, but they also have a huge demand. And so they're hiring farmers to literally make this mixture and then put it into a pill press and then create these pills that look legitimate, but they're not. Okay. So they basically take a binding agent, they put the active ingredient, which is the fentanyl, into it, they stir it together with a stick in a bucket, and then put it into a press and then make those pills. Then they ship them over to us and sell them on the streets. So you can see here that if the dough represents the binding agent and the chocolate chips represents the fentanyl, then the pills that are there to the right are, the dough balls represent a pill. Not each one of those has equal amounts of fentanyl in it, okay? The blue one is what the cartels want to make. However, they don't have quality control measures in place, like a pharmaceutical company would, and therefore the red one gets made 6 out of 10 times. The red pill is a potentially deadly pill. According to the DEA, 6 out of 10 pills that are being confiscated off the streets and tested by their laboratory are potentially deadly doses. Okay, so that was just a year ago, it was 4 out of 10, and now it's 6. So they're never too young to start the conversation. So our drug prevention program starts at 6th grade, 5th grade. Just start to have the talk. You don't have to talk, about scary facts and stuff. You just say, hey, drugs are very dangerous, right? Marijuana is still dangerous. We've legalized marijuana. We have alcohol in our lives. We have these substances in our vaping devices that an adult may not have a problem with that, but a child does. Their young developing brain is far more susceptible to addiction than the adult brain. And there's plenty of studies that have determined that. And so we have to make sure that we're not allowing our kids to use, or at least holding off the use. So when they become teenagers, teens, that's a transition period from childhood to adulthood. And in that transition is less dependence on their parents and more dependence on their friends. It's a scary thing. Plus, risk-taking is a very important part of adolescence. They want to find where's the boundaries, and so they're going to push limits. And so it's a combination of things that really could end up with drug use, right? Drug use is a risky behavior. And so here we have parents that really need to be on top of things when they have a teenager at home, especially if they have a kid that's strong-willed, right? Strong-willed means they like to do things through experimenting, not just kind of watch their brother get in trouble for something. They want to do it themselves and see if they also get in trouble, right? That's that strong-willed personality type. If you have a strong-willed child, watch out. You also need to probably update your skill set, okay, your parenting skill set to be able to manage that child. Don't think, you may have 3 other kids who are great, compliant, they're willing to listen to you, then you have the one that doesn't want to listen to you, right? They want to do things their way. That's the strong-willed child, and they are at risk, okay? We have some trends that are occurring. There's this rainbow fentanyl. So rainbow fentanyl is like a pill that doesn't look like very much, looks like candy. It could be something that would be sold at a party, and kids may not think that it's a dangerous substance, and it's a fentanyl pill, essentially. We talked about how the brain is not fully formed until 25 years of age. That's during that development, they're at more risk, higher risk of addiction. However, the older we can get them before they use, the safer we can be, right? So if they're very young, 15, 16 years of age, if we're allowing them to drink alcohol, what we need to do is make sure that at those younger years, we're really keeping them off the substances. And then as they get older, 18, they may go off to college. We don't have control over them anymore, but they're at least a little bit safer because their brain is a little bit older, okay? So I've heard of parents who say, well, we have to teach our kids how to drink because they're gonna drink when they get to college. What are their limits? Well, I understand that philosophy. However, it's addiction that we have to worry about, right? That brain programming it into it and then keeping it there going into adulthood, right? So you're allowed to check cell phones, you're allowed to take away property, right? Up to the age of 18, even if they purchased that with their own money, okay? So they used their birthday money and they bought a phone, it is yours to take away. If they call the cops, say, go ahead, call the cops. Cops are gonna do nothing about it, right? They're gonna go up and say, good job, Mom, good job, Dad, right? If they don't, call the supervisor. I'm a supervisor, just call the supervisor. And that deputy or police officer has to be just educated a little bit about it, okay? So some other trends that are occurring is we have xylazine, which is a veterinary tranquilizer that gets added to it. So what they're trying to do with these additions is they're trying to extend the high, because the high is very short. And so they're trying to extend the high. And the problem is with xylazine is that Narcan does not have an effect on it. We'll talk about Narcan a little more in a minute. But it doesn't have an effect on it. So we have someone, we see an overdose who sprays some of this in their nose, and then nothing. They don't come back. Maybe there's too much xylazine in it. Protonidazine is another thing that's being added, which increases the potency. It's 3 times stronger than fentanyl, but it's also an opioid. By the way, this fentanyl is synthetic. And so the cartels make this stuff in unlimited quantities because it is synthetic, okay? So if you think about heroin, which is a natural opioid, it comes from the poppy plant, the sap from the poppy plant. It has growing seasons, packaging, processing, and shipping. Whereas this fentanyl, this stuff is so cheap to make and it's so potent that it's just business-wise, it just makes sense to flood our market with it, right? And that's exactly what we're doing. So Xanax and Valium is another thing that's being added to it, just to try and lengthen the high. And then there's another thing that the DEA started at one of our conferences. They brought up that they were seeing, it's called Go to the Light, which is where teenagers purposely overdose on fentanyl, and then their friend brings them back after a certain period of time. You guys remember Flatliners, that movie, where medical students would shock each other and then stop their heart for a certain time and then bring them back, shock them back? Something similar. So yeah, we have a few teens who are willing to take that risk and to play games like that. But if you know as parents to maybe have those conversations of this stuff, you may not come back. This stuff is so potent, it might have xylazine in it, it might have Xanax or something in it mixed in. You just don't know what this stuff. You think you're getting a fentanyl pill and you think you're so smart that you can handle this. You don't know what's in it. Right? So one thing, working with the community, working with parents, for many years I was a school resource officer, dealt with a lot of cases of addiction and stuff. And also kids that were in the foster care system, right? And one thing that I realized is if you can do this, if you can make your child feel loved, accepted, and wanted on a daily basis, you can help, that will increase the protective factor, okay? It will cause them to come to you when they're experiencing hardship in life, and who doesn't at some point, right? And how do we express those things? Because if these things are, when they're expressed, if the communication occurs in the recipient, how do we say these things so that they hear it? Okay, and so in our parent project that I taught, there's 3 ways that they recognize, say that teenagers recognize love, and that would be verbal, I love yous, hugs and kisses, and written notes. So written could be a text message, it could be a note on a mirror, and just saying, hey, I love you, have a good, hope you do well on the test, something like that. But we have to do that on a daily basis, even when they're being bad, okay? Because it softens their heart, it keeps us connected, and it'll get them to come to you when life is tough. Okay, that's what we want. We don't want them turning to substances, using that as an excuse. Want to know, so the signs of an overdose and how to use naloxone. So when this stuff, so fentanyl kills by stopping your breathing and causing unconsciousness. So some of these kids might think, well, I'll just spray Narcan in my nose when I start to overdose. That's not possible, right? When you start to overdose on this stuff. So people want to get high off of it. If someone wants to get high, they're going to get to that ultimate state, but then they don't know when they've gone too far. Like what is that, perfect state? They won't be able to spray this in their nose. So not being able to breathe, maybe they can't breathe effectively, but they are breathing a little bit. Their lips may turn blue, fingertips turn blue, their skin, if they have dark skin, it may turn gray. This is a medical emergency. You have to call 911, get Narcan, spray it in their nose, and get them to advanced medical care, okay, to the hospital. We can't play around with this stuff. So there's a case, Trinity Cornejo. She was a teenage student, 17 years old at Troy High School in Fullerton. She went to a get-together. She came home from that get-together, and her mom said she was on the nod. On the nod means that she's kind of just fallen asleep, and then wake up, and then you kind of just fall asleep again, and then wake up. And she was doing that over and over. That's an opioid. She has an opioid on board. That's a symptom of it. And so she came home, she took her makeup off, she brushed her teeth, she went to bed, and passed away that night. What likely happened was that she took a pill, she took something at that party, it was absorbing into her system, the effects were starting to be seen, and then it all absorbed into her system. So when you start, if you see something like that, that is the time to spray Narcan. That is the time to call 911, right? Get to it before it progresses. Okay. And then this drug talk doesn't stop with one time, right? You have a regular talk. When I was raising my kids, my wife and I would have regular talks. I would talk about something that happened at work in their age-appropriate way, right? Just talk about the dangers of it, to the point where if we bring home a glass of wine and it's in the back and they're helping us take out our groceries, they won't touch that bag. You can get that, Dad, right? So maybe I scared them too much. I don't know. I'm glad that they don't want to touch it, because their young developing brain, we don't want them using anything like that, right? So having regular talks is very good to help protect them about the dangers. You want to increase the risk factor associated with addictive substances. And then if you do suspect drug use of any type, you want to have Narcan in the home, or Kloxxado, right? And so so Kloxxado is just a stronger version. You're going to talk more about that right in a minute. So they'll explain the differences between them, but having that in the house is so important, because the pre-hospital care is extremely important to save a life, okay? And now that it's being added to marijuana, vape pens, it's being added, we're finding it tested in vape pens, it's being added to cocaine and heroin and all the other kind of street drugs that are out there. There's fentanyl test kits that people can buy, that if they're a heroin addict, for instance, they can test their heroin to make sure that it doesn't have fentanyl in it, but it's going to, because that's just how we're finding it. It's being added to everything. Okay?
These are name brands of naloxone, and naloxone is an opioid antagonist. So when an opioid exerts its effect in the brain, it binds to a mu receptor, opens the mu receptor, and euphoria is one of the side effects, but so is respiratory depression. And naloxone outcompetes the opioid for the receptor and closes it. So it's effectively an antidote. And some years ago, right in the middle of the sort of heroin epidemic, Adapt Pharma came out with Narcan, because most of what we were using in terms of naloxone on the street or with users was either injectable form, or it was like a syringe with a nasal atomizer, and it was clumsy to use, and it came in a bag. And this company said, well, why don't we just package them like this? And so the box of Narcan there on the left has 2 of these. They're 4 milligrams each, and they're very effective at reversing a pill overdose or a heroin overdose. But when I say pill, I mean the pharmaceutical grade. However, along with the fentanyl epidemic and increased potency, guess what? This isn't reliably reversing a fentanyl overdose or a synthetic overdose anymore because of that 50x potency. So Kloxxado was developed, and it's the exact same thing, but it's twice as strong. So now you get a box with 2 of these that's 8 milligrams each, and statistics show that 78% of overdoses now take 2 or more of these, and that's why the more potent version was developed. And it's a relatively new drug, but it's easy to get with the prescription. The good news is that this you can get by walking into a pharmacy and saying, I'll have some Narcan, please, and the pharmacist will give it to you. And just as of a few weeks ago, the FDA approved this to be over the counter, meaning that you can start pulling it off shelves soon. So you could get a bunch of this, or you can get less of this, but you gotta have something. And the most important bit is here on the right. 80% of overdose deaths occur in someone's home, and 40% of them have a bystander standing by when it's happening. This is like friends that are at a concert at Coachella, and somebody basically uses something and passes out. And that's why we're doing a national campaign to make everybody aware that, hey, you may not use drugs, your friends may not use drugs, but your friends of friends may use drugs, and you can either stand there helplessly while somebody's dying of brain hypoxia and respiratory depression, or you can be the hero. And I can't tell you how, I know these stories firsthand, how traumatic it is for a teenager or a young adult to be in a place where somebody's physically dying in front of them and have no ability to do anything about it other than call 911 and wait. So the message that we're trying to, given how prevalent this is, and it could be at a Starbucks, it could be at a concert, it could be at a pool party, it could be virtually anywhere these days, we want people to start thinking of this like you would think of an EpiPen, with like anaphylactic nut allergy, except that everybody potentially has that now, and so everybody gets to carry an EpiPen around, and we want to just kind of normalize that. We want parents to have it in a house like they'd have a fire extinguisher, and we want them to talk to their kids like we just told you, to raise awareness. and just empower them to do something about it. And these aren't big. They can put them in their backpacks and carry them rather easily, and they could be the person that saves one of their friends.
And so if I'm not overdosing of fentanyl and someone gives me some Plexado or Narcan, what happens?
Nothing.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's
So
incredibly
there's no
safe.
harm.
There are no side effects, really.
Okay, so I also just read this morning, just to scare us a little more, that there was a school and there was juice that was laced with fentanyl. It's like 12 kids, they passed around this juice and they all started barfing and getting sick. And they had to call 911, they had no idea what was going on. So it's just like juice. So now it's, you just have to be so careful. So if you have a conversation with a school administrator, I know that our school is carrying Narcan now, but I would encourage you guys, everyone should be having it in their purse, their pocket, their cars, their schools. Everyone should train on how to do it. There's a video, so it's like a 10-minute video. What else? Anything else, Brian? And
Yeah.
Then we'll go to Q&A.
Yeah, excuse me. What I wanted to mention was that we've had investigations where someone has gone to a hotel room and they used fentanyl in the hotel room. Maybe they had an overdose there, and then it wasn't properly cleaned. And so the next people who came in afterwards felt sick from it, or a toddler or baby is crawling across the floor and breathes it in or ingests it, and then has an overdose. And we've had cases where parents have been investigated for child abuse and drug use because their child got sick from a fentanyl overdose because it's in their blood. And then they realize that it's the people that were there before them were the ones who were the users. And so be aware that you travel and you don't know where this stuff is being used, right? What about a rental car? If someone used it in the rental car and it's still in there. By the way, if you go into a public restroom, for instance, or any restroom, and you smell burnt popcorn, burnt fentanyl smells like burnt popcorn. So that's something to know, that if you ever go in there and you're getting exposed to that, evacuate the area immediately and then tell whoever is in charge to shut that bathroom down for 24 hours and ventilate it out. So we have that problem in some of our public libraries where homeless are coming in, or somebody might use in the bathroom, and they use it because they don't want to ingest it anymore. What they want to do is get it in their body quickly, so they smoke it, and so then that smell is in there. So things to be aware of.
Okay, we're going to go around. Does anyone have questions?
And thank you so much for this information, but California does have Good Samaritan laws on anything having to do with Narcan or similar drugs. So if you do have an opportunity to use it and administer it to somebody, complete stranger or whatever, you will have absolutely no liability, civil, criminal, professional. It's for teachers too. And this law has been on the books for quite a while, but you'll have no liability at all. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you. There's actually another Good Samaritan law on the books, and that is for teens or someone who's at a party and say they walk into the bathroom and somebody's down, looks like they may be overdosed, that teens don't want to call 911 because they don't want their friends or themselves to get in trouble. And so we do as much awareness as we can of this law so that they call 911. We don't want them to take that person into the car and then transport them to the hospital and then dump them in the parking lot, which is something we've seen, or to clean up and sterilize the environment first and then call 911, because that's too much time where the person has been down. And so we want them to call 911. The way the law works is that if we show up, as long as it's a medical emergency, we will not charge anybody with the crime. But if that was my call, I would shut that party down. I would collect any drugs, alcohol, things that I see that I can get my hands on. Usually if the party's really big, I'm not going to be able to detain everybody, but I will detain, if it's a smaller party, the teenagers and call parents, right? But that party's not going to continue on. I don't want anybody else overdosing. Now there is a caveat to it. If I show up to that door, that front door, and they shut the door and lock it in front of me, I can kick that door in, place that person under arrest, and then my partners will go and deal with the person who's down, right? We're not going to let the person die just because, they shut the door in our face. Okay.
Thank you for being here. 2 questions. One, are canines trained to detect fentanyl? And if so, are they being utilized in our schools and elsewhere? And the other one, totally unrelated, are our local pharmaceutical companies safe?
I'll answer the first part. So our canines are used for fentanyl. We have to be very careful. Our canines can overdose as well. And so we actually have Narcan for them that we can spray, doggy Narcan. But we do use them to detect it. The other thing, we don't use them on school grounds. That's because of case law. We're not allowed to go onto schools and use our canines. Private companies, so a school can hire a private company with a canine that's a drug detection dog to come in and do that. But we cannot use our public dogs, law enforcement dogs on school grounds. It's just case law. So then the other part, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, there's some misconception about, all pills being potentially dangerous now, and the ones that are prescribed by a doctor that are picked up from a pharmacy are 100% safe. We just tell people that unless it was prescribed for you, you can't take a pill from another person, even if they said it was prescribed for them. You just can't trust that, but there's no worry for people that are using their own prescriptions.
Not in Mexico.
Okay, we have a question
Well,
here.
we're talking about the U.S.
No, I know, but from what I've understood is now the Mexican pharmacies are getting the cartels have traded into them. And you can go to a pharmacy in Mexico and not know what you're going to get.
Yeah,
That's possible.
Which is important for the kids to know too.
So my question was in regards to the trach, which is stronger than fentanyl. If Narcan doesn't work on that, does the 8 milligrams of Coloxone, if I'm getting that right, will that work on it? No.
What was the question?
the tranquil.
She's asking if
Coloxone.
anything is an antidote to tranq.
Right, so tranq combined with an opioid will be additive in effect, and tranq, if you were to take it by yourself, generally won't cause respiratory depression. What we're seeing is that when it's often mixed with an opioid. So we just say use the naloxone regardless, because we don't know. And if you can reverse the opioid part of the mixture, then you're still better off. Even though that person might not wake up, they're more likely to start breathing again.
But there's some really bad effects of tranq, right? You want to go into that? I mean, it's super scary. Like your body parts start falling off, your flesh falls off.
People that inject tranq lose limbs. I mean, that's what it comes down to, because it causes tissue necrosis and infection that rapidly progresses. When you try to inject it into a vein, it causes the vein to sclerose and like shut down. And so all the tissue that was around there starts to lose blood supply. And so tranq users are showing up and having amputations on it. Pretty gruesome side effect of using that drug.
Real quick, scary story. 3 kids go to Cancun, go down there, their college friend, hey, pick me up some Oxycontin, and they get something for him, bring it home to him, he dies. Scary thing is, 2 of the kids' parents wanted Ambien. So someone made a point of that. These pharmacies in Mexico, I think there's 5 stories, but the LA Times front page on Sunday talking about these pharmacies are dangerous and the cartel are loading them up.
What is the cost for this? And shouldn't this be an alarm for parents to see where the funding is going?
Cost for what? You mean how much pills cost?
For the pill.
Cheap.
So they're really cheap. So they could be as low as $2 up to $10, depending on where you live and where you're purchasing it. So we've had I've talked to the DEA and just kind of get a sampling of DEA agents who work different areas of our county, and they all came up with different numbers for what they're seeing in their regions. And so it varied from $2 to $10.
So you can yourself for $2.
Yes.
A question for Brian. Where is your funding coming from? Is it from the county, or you can get federal government support for this war on drugs?
So we primarily do prevention, and there's not a whole lot of money in prevention. So, which is horrible because that's where the fight needs to go. We've had a war on drugs for 40 years, and we're no better off now than we were when we started. So we have to start working on the prevention side. We need to fund that, and we just don't have the funding for prevention. We can't measure it. It's hard to measure lives saved, but we can measure lives lost or pills seized. And so we tend to fund those things that we can measure. And so, unfortunately, prevention doesn't get a whole lot of money. And that's why my unit, we work very hard, but we're very small. We're just very, we have a nonprofit organization called Drug Users Life Abuse that raises money to help support us so that we have a dream of next year hiring another deputy in our unit, that they would raise enough money to be able for us to be able to hire someone for the next academic year. As our drug problem continues to get worse, we have higher demand. I need to hire more people in my unit. We just don't get enough money sent our way to do that. But we have great drug prevention programs, and we're doing as much as we can, but it's not enough, clearly.
I have a question for David. You mentioned earlier at the beginning about the medicated assisted treatments with naltrexone, methadone, and the efficacy there. They work very well. Now in Europe, they were able to do that kind of gavage any type of epidemic there. What's your thoughts on why here, is it because big pharma has no money to be made, we don't market it well, and why the addiction continues to worse when we have all the resources?
That's a lecture, but it's several things in the United States. Number one, methadone clinics are federally regulated OTPs, meaning that doctors are not allowed to prescribe it from their office. You can only get methadone from an opioid treatment program, and there aren't many of those in certain places. So whereas they're effective, there's just far too few of them. So then buprenorphine comes along, which is the main drug I use, much safer than methadone, can be prescribed from a doctor's office, but the DEA said, well, what we're going to make doctors do is go to an 8-hour training course and get a special DEA license called an ex-DEA license. And then once they have that license, we're going to let them have up to 30 patients at a time for the first year. Then after a year, they can apply for 100 patients to treat. So here we have a raging opioid epidemic, and we're saying we need to treat it, and the DEA is saying, yeah, just not that much. Then on top of that, insurance companies basically make all the rules they want to make in terms of how doctors get paid. And for mental health and substance use disorder, the payments are very poor. They don't pay on par with other medicine. And then there's all kinds of stigma that we have as a society about people that use drugs and end up having problems as a result. And what we're doing to combat that is trying to help people recognize that this is a chronic disease. It's often been thought of as a moral failing, and that people should suck it up and make better decisions, but that's all fine and well when you have normal brain chemistry, but when you no longer have the dopamine level and it's all you can do to get out of bed and spend your entire day trying not to go into withdrawal, you just don't have the ability to do that. And so it's a bunch of different problems all at once. So a whole generation of doctors came out feeling like, oh, well, we're being told to prescribe more opiates, and it kind of didn't make that much sense. Like we would do like an inguinal hernia surgery or some minor surgery in the surgery center, and I would be checking the patient out, and the surgeon will have written for 30 Percocet with 1 refill for something that needs maybe 5, and then Tylenol. And so that all got really set in motion by Purdue Pharma. They were quite brilliant in how they went about convincing a generation of doctors that they need to prescribe more pain pills. And on top of that, they said these weren't addictive when used for pain, knowing full well that they were highly addictive. And then all hell broke loose. So now the pendulum has swung very much in the other direction, and doctors have to look at cures reports before they prescribe any pain medicine. And there are groups of patients that need large amounts of pain medicine, like chronic pain patients and cancer patients. And we're getting this other opposite effect now where some people are being cut off from the pain medications they need. And so anyways.
Quickly add to that real quick, that with Purdue Pharma, when we figured out how addicting those pills are and regulations started having to rein it back in and to only prescribe it for more serious pain, we still had a lot of addicted people, right? And so it was around 2014, 2015 when you see that curve of deaths rise up, and that's really when fentanyl problems started occurring, right? They started flooding our market, so the cartels fed that demand that we had about that time. And a lot of doctors were concerned. The DEA was doing arrests of some doctors who were overprescribing to the community, and they were getting arrested. So doctors started regulating themselves and saying, okay, I don't want that to happen to me. So all this started happening about the same time, which then the cartels were perfectly happy to bring in fentanyl and feed that demand.
Good. I was curious about the medications used to treat this addiction. Methadone being the one I can remember, and the two new ones you mentioned. Are these medications themselves something that needs to be taken indefinitely, or can one wean off them after a while?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our patients, when they come to us, that's the first question out of their mouth. How long do I have to be on this? And most of them, their lives are quite the disaster. They have social problems, legal problems, relationship problems, financial problems, housing problems, and they're asking, like, how long do I need to be on this? And so the answer is, well, not necessarily forever, but kind of like if you're a type 2 diabetic and you're 65 pounds overweight and you don't exercise and you don't eat well and you have heart disease and hypertension and all the things that go along with it, it really depends on how much you can change your behaviors. But for some people it is indefinitely. We have today a patient who's been off for 1 year doing great. He showed up in our office and he said, I relapsed. And so, you know, we always leave the door open, but I look at these medications like I look at insulin for diabetes. You know, some people have to be on it for a lifetime.
I got a question on policy. My wife and I, we have a 10-month-old, so we have a little bit more of a runway, but you see policy and you see border aside, you look at San Francisco, you look at LA, and their solution to the problem seems to be open market, come get it via the city, we'll inject you, whatever, to help you. How do you address it from a private market and a public market where, you know, it's getting into, you said, marijuana, which is the legal drug, and it's not a gateway drug, they say, but it seems to be, if it's in that, it's going to be in everything else. How do you, as a private citizen, parent of a future teenager, how do you address that at this level? It's a nip it in the bud, if you will.
So I think that's where setting the values, right, of the home. When you raise your kids, make sure that you're reminding them that they are part of a family system, that they are, what they do affects you, right? Use the example that if my son were to get hooked on drugs, I'm going to use all of my savings, all of my retirement savings, everything to try and save his life, right? So if you talk to your child, at those stages of life, and just have those conversations and say, it doesn't just affect you, it affects all of us, okay, in this family. Just like when, a mobile that floats over the crib, you touch one side of it, the other part moves around, right? It's like that. We're a system, and so that's a good thing to, as you raise them, remind them that, hey, we're all working together. What you do affects us. The other thing is just making sure that you're establishing yourself as the parent, right? That you don't, so for instance, if a teenager says, but Sally's mom lets her go do that, that's them telling you how to parent, right? And that's where you say, that's not gonna happen. What I say goes. And this is the reason why. It's telling why is a good reason, because that helps them think and rationalize, right? And so explaining the reasons behind your, then also being careful how you use alcohol and substances in your own home. If you come home, pour that glass of wine, take a drink and say, ooh, today was rough, you may have just taught your child to use alcohol as medicine, right? And so knowing, seeing your own behaviors, setting those boundaries, handing down discipline as necessary, and then making sure that you remind them that they don't stand alone, that they affect everybody.
But on a public policy level, how would you, if you can, recommend?
Public policy is tough because One, I can't take a stand on public policy.
And it's California.
Right now, there's this is from the sheriff, he can talk about it, and so I'll just kind of repeat what he says, that when we have legislation that goes through and pushes up towards Sacramento to try and have something that helps us enforce laws, it gets shot down in the safety committee. We have right now people up there that will not pass anything that incarcerates people. So right now we're going through a decarceration period rather than an incarceration period. And so however you stand on that issue, that seems to be what's going on right now. So we can't really count on legislation at this point to fix the problem, unfortunately.
And that's why we're doing events like this. Can you guys comment on some of the recent news stories that are going around Halloween time about fentanyl being mixed into candy? And is that a real concern, or how should we be worried about it?
So that was just somebody who was using that time period as a way to sneak in some drugs. Okay, so this is not a problem where our candy is now tainted in America and we have to worry about this for our kids at Halloween. This was just somebody who had, opened up a package, filled it with the pills, trying to sneak it past security at the airport. It was not widespread, as far as I know. It only happened at this one time, but it got a lot of news coverage, and therefore, a lot of scare because it was Halloween time, and we were all concerned that candy is now tainted with these pills. That was just that person who did that, and they were using Halloween as a way to sneak in a bunch of candy, pills in candy boxes.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, I did some media stuff on this in the fall, and there's no evidence whatsoever that they're targeting trick-or-treaters. They will bring drugs across that look like candy, and they'll put it in Skittles, but they weren't targeting little kids. It's not their market. And but it got everybody into, it got sensationalized.
Well, thank you guys so much. This was amazing.